Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Ways and Means Committee. John Quincy, Chair, and joined by Council Members Yang, Palomasano, Council Vice President Glidden, and Council Member Andrew Johnson. I think Council Member Bender will be joining us in just a few moments. We have 32 items on our agenda today, 31 of which are on our consent agenda. So if I could just run through those, we'll see if we can dispense with that and get to our discussion item. Our first is a series of actions, legal settlements from the City Attorney's Office, as well as a grant acceptance from Local Initiative Support Corporation for policing conference attendance. That's item number 6. Item number 7 is from the Communications Department. It's the gift acceptance from Clear Channel Outdoor for display time. The Convention Center brings forward 2 items. One is a bid from Messenger Construction for Convention Center mezzanine level office remodeling project, and the second is a bid for Electronic Design Company for Convention Center audio upgrade project. Finance and Property Services brings forward 3 items: a contract with TALX Inc., that's a liability cap language approval, as well as an acquisition of real estate for East Side Maintenance Facility project at 340 27th Avenue Northeast. And then a contract for design services with RSP Architects for the Hiawatha Maintenance Facility Campus Expansion Project. Human Resources has the contract amendment to increase and extend 8 Human Capital Consulting Professional Services contracts. As Information Technology Department has the contract amendment with Tow Exchange Inc. for towing software and operations system management. Referred from the Community Development Regulatory Services Committee, we have the 2016 Affordable Housing Trust Fund project recommendations. And we have a grant acceptance awarded by Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development for August 1st round of deeds redevelopment grant program, and a bid for demolition and site clearance at 1215 2nd Avenue North. From the Health, Environment, Community Engagement Committee, we have a grant from Minnesota Department of Health for Public Health Nurse Home Visiting Program, contract amendment with Stair Step Foundation for Diabetes Reduction Services, the Skyway Senior Center. This is a donation acceptance from the Friends of Skyway Senior Center. And the Skyway Senior Center also has a letter of intent to transfer operations to Ecumen for its operations. We also have the Community Engagement Plan for Neighborhoods 2020, and a grant from the Department of Justice for Group Violence Intervention Program. Public Safety and Civil Rights and Emergency Management Committee brings forward a grant award for Minnesota Department of Public Safety, as well as a contract amendment for Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for analysis of DNA case evidence, travel expense donation acceptance for Police Executive Research Forum, and travel expense donation acceptance for National Network of Safe Communities at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Transportation and Public Works Committee forwards us the Franklin Avenue and West Broadway pedestrian improvements, Hennepin Avenue reconstruction project, parking ramp elevator modernization project. That's a contract amendment with Morcon Construction, and a bid for supervisory control and data acquisition system. So those are the 31 items. I know we have a question or comment from Councilmember Yang on one of those items.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here's the right.
Sorry?
Here's the right nameplate.
Oh,
I was using Councilmember Palmer's
Now we know who you are,
nameplate.
right.
Apologies about that. I just want to make 2 comments.
Sure.
One, item number 15, and one, item number 17.
At your will.
For number 15, I just wanted to say how grateful I am that this is happening. And I know that my comments will not be as dramatic or emotional as the one last Tuesday, but nonetheless, I'm still very happy that this is happening, especially for the projects that are happening in Ward 5. That being said, item number 17, I just have a question if we have staff here to address that. It's just kind of this question about, once we demo the building, is there a plan for what happens next? I didn't see that in the RCA, and is it appropriate to be asking that?
Okay, let's check in on that. I'm not sure. Is there anybody here from CPED who might be able to give us a quick explanation? I'm trying to, see if the 2 CPED people are interested in talking about this particular item.
And Mr. Chair, I can also call staff afterwards to check in, which is fine too.
We'll make sure some of that is addressed, but I was hoping at least, Ms. Brennan, do you have any information on this particular item, or is this something we can refer to for future follow-up for Councilmember Yangs? Okay. Councilmember Yang, I'd ask if we can at least look forward to passing this on and get that information to you.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. It did come through that committee, but I'm not sure about the next steps for that particular parcel.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on the consent agenda items? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Those items carry. Thank you very much. Now we get to move down to our finance property services discussion item. This is item number 32, related a little bit to some of our housing investment strategies. So, Mr. Ruff, if you could walk us through the investment policy and strategy revisions.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Mark Ruff, the Chief Financial Officer. First of all, I just want to take this opportunity to introduce our new Deputy CFO. This is Lori Johnson. To my left, Lori's first day is today, and so what better way to start it than the Ways and Means Committee?
I couldn't think of no better. And on Halloween, when she's appropriately attired, life is great. Thank you.
Yes.
Welcome, Ms. Johnson.
So periodically we review our investment policy. There is a process that we follow, as the city is aware, the city council members are aware. We have an independent advisor for our investments. We think that's a very healthy thing because it's not someone who is a broker then that's dependent on buying and selling securities to give us advice. That firm's name is Elwood out of Chicago. And then we also have most of our investments handled by 3 different fund managers who compete against each other a little bit on yield. And I think overall has shown good benefits for the city in terms of the management of those funds. The city has historically put safety as the preeminent goal within our investment policy, and we've also kept our investments fairly short in term. And in fact, right now, the average life or the average maturity of an investment in our portfolio is less than 2 years. We primarily invest according to state law. We have very restrictive state laws on what we can invest in, but primarily we invest in U.S. Treasuries, what we would call fixed income securities, U.S. Treasuries, agencies, which are either direct or indirect guarantees of the federal government. And then we have some commercial paper, we have some bank CDs, but predominantly it's really treasuries and agencies. So one of the overall recommendations from staff here is to change our investment policy to go out a little longer than the maximum term that we have right now in our investments. The maturities in our investment right now cannot exceed 5 years. The last payment date can't exceed 5 years. And so we have difficulty achieving a high yield in today's environment. We are averaging around 1%, which given our short term of investments is not bad, but we have a fair amount of money that we invest every day, depending on the time of year. It's between $650 and $750 million. And so being able to increase the yield on our investment portfolio obviously has substantial returns for the city. And so that's one reason for looking at this. And so we've taken the advice of our advisors and compared ourselves, as was described in the RCA, to other public entities. And we have a much shorter portfolio than other similarly sized entities within Minnesota. And so we are recommending that we extend that, instead of a maximum term of 5 years, have a maximum weighted average maturity or weighted average life, depending on the kind of investment, of 5 years. And so we think that automatically, and there was a statement from our advisors in the packet, which just says that automatically we should be able to increase our yield by 30 basis points, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're only receiving 100 basis points, or 1% versus a third, that's a third increase in our investment returns. And so generally we think we can do this. It's not going to affect the safety. And with interest rates starting to get to rise a little bit, then we will be able to take advantage of some of those increasing interest rates with some longer term investments. We also have a small change, which is commercial paper, which is very short term investments. Right now we're limited to 180 days of maturity, and we'd like to go out to 270, which is more typical for the industry. So that's the general investment policy. As we were reviewing generally the investment policy, we also have had discussions both with council and with our friends at CPED, and Andrea Brennan from the Director of Housing at CPED is with us this afternoon as well for any questions you may have about this program. And this new program that has been discussed not just among the city, but also the county, and then also nationally, is NOAA, Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing. And so we looked at our investment portfolio and recognized that a substantial amount of our investments are through government-sponsored entities for mortgages. Okay, they are mortgage-backed securities, which are both single-family and multifamily mortgages. They are typically pooled investments, meaning that they could be mortgages of an apartment building in Texas or California. And we buy this because, number one, state law says that it's an eligible investment. We get a little more yield on those investments because they're not directly, but they are indirectly guaranteed by the federal government. And the federal government during the recession did back all of these obligations. They have a little higher yield, but typically they can also be prepaid earlier. And so this is another reason that we want to change the investment policy, is to be able to expand our use of the mortgage-backed securities investment tool. But related to NOAA, in discussions with actors, activists within the housing community, we did start talking to places like Common Bond, which is a large nonprofit, and the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund and McKnight, which is also very active in this area. And both of those groups have purchased properties under the NOAA program as a pilot for themselves, and found out that they are having conversations with Freddie Mac, and Freddie Mac is a government-sponsored entity, where Freddie Mac is recognizing this problem of NOAA nationally and is looking at ways of trying to do direct placement of securities. So right now we're just buying those mortgage-backed securities on the secondary market. Right? They're looking at a direct placement of these securities to socially minded investors. And before we started the conversations with them, they were thinking about foundations. So foundations who can invest in a lot of things that we can't as a public entity, equities, stocks. They were trying to get them to buy 2% type of investments. Well, if you recognize that we're only making 1% on our investments, and so if we could get 2%, that's a much better investment that we have. And if it could be directed towards properties that would be guaranteed by Freddie Mac, indirectly guaranteed by the federal government, within Minneapolis that are associated with NOAA properties, that seems like a good intersection of what we are looking for in terms of both yield on our investments, but also at the same time, a directed investment to benefit a property. So that was the evolution of this, and we've been working closely with CPED and as well as the other nonprofit and for-profit folks who are interested in NOAA. We've also been talking with Freddie Mac. Their program is not fully baked yet, but as long as we were going to change our investment policy, we thought we would bring this before the Ways and Means for consideration. It would really be redirecting our investments to Minneapolis specific, and it could be as small as a 50-unit building and a mortgage on the 50-unit building, or it could be 100 or 200 units. But Freddie Mac is, instead of doing this on a very large scale, is willing to look at these transactions individually and place those investments then with the city of Minneapolis. Now, this is different than the money that's proposed in the mayor's budget. If you remember that is gap money. So what we are talking about is Freddie Mac will give one of these buyers a first mortgage, which will cover 75 to 80% of the cost of the acquisition. And what Greater Minnesota Housing Fund has been doing, working with Hennepin County, and now have a request into the city, is to supply the gap financing, that money that is the difference between the acquisition price and the first mortgage. So we are talking about an investment that covers the first mortgage. So how does that benefit the property? Well, it benefits the property really, number one, is these would be longer term investments. And so Freddie Mac is talking about as much as a 15-year term. And so they have fixed rate financing for a longer period of time than they could maybe get in the commercial market. So that's a benefit for the properties. And two is that Freddie Mac is willing to write down their fees slightly compared to other transactions on this more limited basis. And so here's how I would describe this: is a nonprofit or a for-profit would find a property they're interested in buying. They would have had been pre-approved by Freddie Mac, because I think we want to underscore that we are not doing underwriting criteria. We are not creating a new pool of money. We're buying an investment. We're buying an investment that's guaranteed by Freddie Mac, which has a very strict underwriting criteria. So these potential purchasers would need to have that type of relationship with Freddie Mac, that there was a trust level there. So Freddie Mac would lend them that money. We would get an investment and we would tie it to something a little better than a treasury. So let's just, for round numbers, say 2%. Freddie Mac would have a guarantee fee on top of that. We don't know the exact amount of that guarantee fee, but for round numbers, let's just say 1%. And then there'd be some servicing fees. So a for-profit or nonprofit buyer would have somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.25% or 3.5% long-term money, which would be then be able for them to turn around and write down rents or afford more capital improvements. So that's the proposal of this program. Why are we acting now before this is all fully in place, and why are we acting now when the mayor's budget has not been formally considered by the council and approved by the council? I think number one is because we are talking about investments. Number one, it seemed as a good opportunity to have this discussion. Two is this would send a signal to places like Freddie Mac that the city of Minneapolis is interested and try to accelerate then the implementation of this program. And three is to send a signal then to the for-profit and nonprofit world who is interested in NOAA that this is another tool. It's not the only tool. It's not going to solve all of the problems, but it is another tool that will help with this emerging problem of availability of affordable housing within the city of Minneapolis. So I think it's important to emphasize that we are putting limits on this. We're not going to have our whole investment portfolio involved in this. In fact, we would recommend no more than 10% of our investment portfolio. I think it's also important to bring up, which is, why would a city not want to do this? These are going to be longer term investments. Potentially, I talked about a 5-year average life as our standard investments. These might be as much as 10 or 12 years average life. So we are going to be locked into a longer investment. Now, we have all sorts of assets and capital replacement, which are long-term as well. But many cities have tried to keep it as a shorter term. And so one potential reason why a city might not want to do this is they don't want to lock up 5 or 10% of their investments for a 10 or 12-year period. These will be marketable securities, but if we traded them, we would probably have to take them, if interest rates are higher, we would lose money on that trade. So that's a weakness of this, but it's clearly a trade-off in the sense of the benefit is we're getting a better yield than on this investment than we are getting with the rest of our portfolio. So the trade-off of a longer investment is more long-term, illiquid, not as liquid of a investment, but the benefit is we get a better interest rate overall for the taxpayers. I think the second thing that is important is that these NOAA properties, when they come up for sale, there's usually a very short closing time. And so there's not going to be the opportunity for 2 or 3 months of discussion among the council and staff as to whether this property is a good one to acquire. What we would prefer is to have the council working with CPED staff, which I know you've already started, on coming up with criteria for NOAA properties. And so that when we have criteria, then we can make this investment relatively quickly in order to facilitate this acquisition, but also to make sure that there's confidence from the buyer's standpoint that this money is available at the rates that they're looking for. So, Mr. Chair, I apologize for the longer description, but I think it is an important change in our policy and want to make sure that all questions are answered.
Thank you very much. It is a lot of information to digest here, and I know we're going to have some questions on it. I think it is also very important. That's why it's on a discussion item, to add some light to that. So let's begin by having Councilmember Glidden with her question, please.
Thank you, Councilmember Quincy, and thank you, Mr. Ruff, for this breaking down a complicated topic, at least for someone who's not a finance professional, into somewhat of an understandable concept, because we have been talking a lot in the community as well as at the city council about naturally occurring affordable housing and how we're losing many units of that type of housing that doesn't have a housing subsidy to keep it affordable, but has been at affordable rates that now is sometimes being sold or has other things happen to put it into an unaffordable bracket for certain residents. I was actually, before asking more questions about this investment decision, I was wondering if Ms. Brennan might like to just give us a little bit of feedback on what more is coming from the housing policy end, just because I think we're trying to understand how this investment policy fits in with what is a developing body of work in our housing division that's going to help us understand how this will all work together. So maybe you could just give us a heads up about what is to come, and then we can go back, and I might have another question for Mr. Ruff about the decisions around the investment policy.
Yeah, Ms. Brennan, if you could, that would be great. I think it would show great intersection between these, two departments, and it's very interesting. So please.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, and members of the committee. There's a number of initiatives that we're currently developing as staff to move forward. One of them has to do with the preservation of existing housing that has some form of subsidy, and that specifically relates to developments that have been financed with proceeds from tax-exempt bonds and equity from low-income housing tax credits. So right now, under our current policy, when we issue those bonds and allocate those credits, developers, they could exercise an ability to opt out of the affordability requirements after year 15. So right now, it's out for public comment right now, or this proposed change, and then it will go before the Community Development Regulatory Services Committee at the end of November 29th. But our proposal is to change what's called our qualified allocation plan, and that would then require any developers who are using an allocation of tax-exempt bonding authority to waive their ability to opt out of the affordability requirements after year 15. So that's not directly related to the naturally occurring affordable housing, but it is extending the affordability of housing that is at risk of going from sort of the more subsidized camp into the market rate, non-affordable. And where those developments tend to occur are in stronger market areas where there's an ability to increase the rent pretty substantially. So that's one effort. As Mr. Ruff noted, we're also working to define the criteria that could be the criteria of properties that would be eligible for funding under the mayor's proposed $1.5 million in the proposed 2017 budget. So we'll be, as Mr. Ruff mentioned, too, one of the necessities of developing any kind of NOAA strategy is the ability to move quickly. There are a lot of investors interested in purchasing rental property in the city of Minneapolis and the region. And so whatever we structure has to be something that is can be very rapidly deployed. So because that's not how our typical kind of gap funding sources work, I'm working with a city attorney's office to propose criteria where we could move a little bit faster. So that is underway, and we're hoping to have something for discussion in the next month as well. Council Vice President Glenn, did you have any other specific?
Yeah, maybe
things in
just one
mind?
more question. Do we assume that if there is a property that comes available, that a nonprofit developer or community developer of some kind that wants to make an offer on the property will need both the gap financing that's part of the mayor's proposed budget as well as this first mortgage in order to kind of put those pieces together to move quickly, or could one work without the other?
Yes. I think that the way that we've discussed it is that it could be, they could definitely work together because as Mr. Ruff mentioned, there is it- the investment policy changes would allow the city to invest in the first mortgage. And the 1.5 million would be something that could be basically would meet the buyer's equity requirement, which is that anywhere between the 20 and 30%. So both pieces are needed for any one development, and it's very possible and probably ideal from our standpoint if those two worked together in the same development. The 1.5 million could probably assist somewhere between 60 units on the low side to, maybe at most 200 units. So that dollar amount probably won't, on the gap side, it probably won't go as far as the investment side could go. And so I think it's more likely that there could be developments where the investments could be made where there isn't the gap funding available any longer.
And then my last question, kind of more on kind of how the market might work, and I don't know if this is more for you or Mr. Ruff, is do we have a sense of whether this first mortgage opportunity is going to be actually attractive to developers to utilize? Have we had any feedback or seen that work before? And how will we know if this ends up being a good way to think about how to incentivize and assist the market?
Sure, and I'll let Mr. Ruff respond to this, but I'd like to first add that, yes, we do know that would be of great assistance to the developers that we've talked to, as well as the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, who's putting together an equity fund on that gap equity side of things. They've indicated that this would be of great benefit to developments that are seeking to socially oriented owner operators that are competing for these properties. They're competing against investors whose model is to increase rents. And so in order to they have to have some ability to compete with that, and having a lower cost of capital is one way that they can do that.
Mr. Ruff, do you want to add anything to that? Thank you, Ms. Brennan.
Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, the feedback that we've had from the private mortgage companies who are working on behalf of some of the nonprofits in this sphere have indicated that the numbers that I laid out earlier in the presentation are 0.75% to 1% lower than what they can get on the commercial market. And as I said, it's a longer term fixed rate financing, which if we're asking for longer term affordability, you would think that we would want longer term investments. But clearly, every nonprofit and for-profit developer may have their own ideas about how they blend all of their financing, not just for one property and for a larger property. So you may find that people make other choices. So as I said, this is a tool. We think that interest rate write-down will mean somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 to $900 per unit per year less in rents, or at least availability for more capital improvements. So it's not going to change the world, but it is going to make a difference for several people in the world. And so I think that's one of the things that the city has as a goal, as I understand, of the city council and the mayor. And I would just like to take this opportunity certainly to thank all of you on the committee. I think all of you have been very encouraging of the naturally occurring affordable housing. Councilmember Quincy spent a number of hours with me talking about this concept prior to this meeting, so I appreciate that guidance. I know that the mayor herself, as well as the CDRS chair, Councilmember Goodman, are also very supportive of NOAA activities as well. And so I think we are trying to be responsive to the city council as well as the development community, just to give them these options to try to find the best way to move quickly on these properties, which seems to be one of the major hurdles for acquisition.
And then just my last, this may be a little bit more of a comment, but I don't know if there are other cities in Minnesota or other jurisdictions, counties in Minnesota that have thought of or want to try this type of investment strategy. I would say just as a larger jurisdiction, my guess is we would be a jurisdiction that's either going first or closer to first on this type of investment strategy, and our ability to show how to put this together could be an incentive to other communities, because I know we are not the only community that is having these exact same discussions. So thank you very much for putting in the work to help offer another tool around this very important issue.
Thank you. I would agree completely, obviously, with Council Vice President Glidden. It is another tool. And in this case, it's before our committee because it's not a CD-related policy, although it's certainly related. But this is an investment policy. This is how the city invests its resources. So my concern, as always, is we've always been a priority of having security, liquidity, diversification, and then yield was the last. This gives us an opportunity to invest in our own properties in the city and increase our yield, which is significant enough without putting too much risk, too much money stored up in a long-term investment that wouldn't be available for other resources to be considered. So, and then the other obvious distinction here is the difference between financing and funding. And in this case, we're not really funding. We're providing a financial opportunity for other people to invest in our products without tying up any capital. So I think it's a very creative solution, and as the Council Vice President indicated, I think it would be great if other jurisdictions, well, if they don't want to do this themselves, at least they could invest in our products. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is great. One of the biggest concerns I hear from my constituents is cost of rising housing, and we know from conversations that Ms. Brennan has briefed council members on that we're losing units, affordable units, faster than we are building them. And so I think it's really exciting to see staff bring forward this innovative kind of approach that would be both hopefully a financial benefit to the city as well as meet our goals around affordable housing. I wanted to understand some more of the details about the timing of how this would roll out. So my understanding of the proposal from staff, knowing that we're not being asked to take action right now necessarily, is that our portfolio overall would be limited to 10% in this type of investment. And then I wanted to get your sense of how long this would take. So if we imagine that that amount of investment could get us to 800 to 1,100 units, I know this is a new thing, but do you imagine that happening over years, or sort of what's the time frame that we could expect for this to take place?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, I honestly don't know. I think clearly there are properties up for sale on a regular basis in the city of Minneapolis, and as Ms. Brennan said, it's a competitive marketplace. I think that this tool would give some of those nonprofit and for-profit developers a little more of an advantage in some of those acquisition efforts. And part of this will be a definition of what the city sees as NOAA properties. But I do know that what I've seen and had presented to me is oftentimes these are 50 to 70 unit buildings, sometimes much smaller. So I would expect it would take at least a couple of years for that to be realized. I don't think that we have one large owner or developer that we're trying to acquire a big portfolio from. I think the idea would be to have targeted areas of the city where this is really the biggest emphasis that we have for our dollars. I would also say that we are not going to be able to make this available to just anybody who wants to buy NOAA property. As I said, we're not the ones making the decision on the underwriting criteria. As the chair mentioned, we are a step away from that. We're buying investments, and it has to be an owner who has confidence of Freddie Mac to be able to essentially be pre-approved, if I can use simple terms, because of the short time frame that exists. And so that will limit us as well. But I think the good news is here in Minnesota, we have very able nonprofit and for-profit developers who are socially minded who should be able to qualify for that. But there's going to be a process initially of working with Freddie Mac on this new program and other government-sponsored entities. Fannie Mae is another entity that is in this marketplace. I don't know whether they have similar efforts as well, but you know, this is a program which could take a couple of years to fully implement.
And then one other maybe question or comment is, I'm interested in understanding if there are policies we could consider that would help us identify properties whether it's requiring notification of the city when a sale is about to occur, or I understand that I think some cities require notification of the city, or even require a property owner to offer to the city to purchase property. So anyway, it could be a comment or a question.
Ms. Brendan, can you help us with that one?
Sure, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender. At this point, we don't have any such requirement where the city is notified on any sort of impending sale of naturally occurring affordable housing. But there are other jurisdictions that have looked at those types of requirements through ordinance. Others have done so through state legislative process. So there is a working group of staff and outside expertise that are looking at different policy options that that you may want to consider in the future.
Thank you. Not seeing any additional questions or comments at this time. I do appreciate this. I do have one quick thought. Will this require an additional RFP for an investment manager on this process? Does this give us another opportunity to add to that resources? I think at one time we had 5 or maybe 7, and we're down to 3, as I understand it. So is this another opportunity for another investment manager to get involved?
Sure, Mr. Chair, I can ask our investment staff to confirm this, but because this would be a direct placement, it wouldn't necessarily require an additional investment manager. This would be, there wouldn't be a custodian. It would be similar to if we went to a bank and bought a CD directly and just held it for a long period of time, that would be a direct investment between us and the entity that is providing the investment. So I see it as outside of our existing investment pool and would not require another manager.
Okay, and so therefore the responsible banking ordinance issues may not apply either if it's existing.
Mr. Chair, I'd have to rely on the city attorney, but preliminarily, I think the answer would be no, but I would need to do some research with the city attorney's office on that question.
Fine. Good. Thanks very much. Not seeing any additional questions, comments, I'll move this action item. Not seeing any other comments. So all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed? And that item carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Ruff. I think that officially concludes the business for the Ways and Means agenda, but I do want to point out we have a couple of other items coming up on our budget subcommittee meetings. We have the November 3rd is when we're going to be hearing from Civil Rights, the Youth Coordinating Board, Municipal Building Commission, followed at 1 o'clock that same day by the Park Board. And then we'll be moving to the November 30th public comment on the tax levy and proposed budget, and going up to budget markup on the morning of December 2nd, followed hopefully in December 7th with the final budget public hearing and budget adoption. So I just wanted to give those heads up on those upcoming dates related to the 2017 recommended budget. Seeing no further business, we are adjourned.